going to be talking about the Queen Elizabeth class battleships. Firstly, thank you to all my friends and the people who engaged in the last video. I found that very inspiring to try to make another one of these. And I just want to say before I even start this, I do not know how long this video will be. I have hardly edited my script. I went through a bit of it earlier today and I was reading it and I was like a quarter way through and I was at 25 minutes. Anyways, deep breaths. But yeah, thank you to my friends for inspiring me to continue doing videos like this. Hopefully this one turns out well. But also you might hear my chair in the background, which I'm quite worried about. But anyways, I'm going to be talking about the Queen Elizabeth battleships. There were 5 of them. They were one of the most important classes to serve for the British Royal Navy. Might even be the most important during World War II and World War One. They were, especially in World War II, they were the backbone of the entire British Navy. They were in the Atlantic, Pacific, Mediterranean, Indian, and Pacific Ocean. All over the place, doing all kinds of jobs. They were very useful. Um, but yeah, I'm going to be looking at the 5 ships. So I actually have, this is my housekeeping and order of discussion, which is actually kind of out of order because I'm actually going to be talking about the 5 battleships first. I'm just going to show you what they look like in during the Second World War, what their badge looks like, and what their motto looks like. Then I'm going to be talking about the geopolitical atmosphere between the British Empire and the German Empire at the time, what the Queen Elizabeth design entailed and how they came to shape, what they were based off of, how they compared to Germany's highest battleships, which were the Bayerns during World War One. Then I'm going to be talking about World War One and the Battle of Jutland. I'm going to be spending a lot of time on the Battle of Jutland. And for World War One, only one of them was not in the Battle of Jutland. Uh, they were they participated in the failed Dardanelles campaign, but at the time of Jutland, they were getting a quick little refit, so they were not there. Then I'm going to be talking about what they were up to in the Inter-Year Wars, and at the same time, in that same one, I'm going to be talking about their design changes and upgrades. Many of them went through heavy changes in between the 2 wars. And then I'm going to be talking about World War II. That's probably going to take me a long time. I have it split into what each ship was doing one by one. And then at the end of the war, I'm going to be talking about the state of each of them and their unfortunate scrapping process. There's a few memorials about them and the conclusions and my final thoughts. So, firstly, is the name of the whole class. Usually the first ship in the class. The rest of them are labeled under that class. So here we have HMS Queen Elizabeth. Um, so everything else is known as the Queen Elizabeth class. I mean, she, of the 4 of them, probably had one of the lesser active careers amongst them. The ships had a kind of weird, a bit of a bad luck streak. I won't lie. But here's what she looks like by 1941 and post on. Here's her badge with the ER and the flower with the crown. Her motto is always the same. Next is HMS Warspite, who I'm going to be talking about a lot in this. That's what she looks like with the new superstructure that 3 of them were given. There's her badge, and her motto is I despise the hardships of war. Next is HMS Valiant, who also got a superstructure upgrade. There is the badge with the rooster, I think. Yeah, I think it's a rooster. I don't know. I should have looked into that. As the badge, and the motto is Valiant and Vigilant. Then we have Barham, who had no motto, but was the flagship of many different fleets, which I'll get into. There's the badge. It looks pretty cool. Lastly is HMS Malaya. There's the badge with the tiger. I think that one's pretty cool. And whose motto is I bring evil to the evil. Absolute banger right there. Alright, so let's get into this. So a look into the state of the British Navy and the naval arms race. So, um, before World War One, the British Empire and the German Empire were engaged in a naval arms race. They were building battleships as quickly as possible, as big as possible, just trying to one up each other. For the most part, the British were getting the upper hand. The British had many different um, yards where they could lay down battleships. The Germans did not. So the British were actually leading for a majority of it. The state of the Navy had heavily changed and evolved since HMS Dreadnought in 1907. HMS Dreadnought was the first ship to have a all big gun layout, and ever since that, every ship pretty much followed suit. The newest post-Dreadnought battleships were the four Iron Duke class. The Iron Dukes are on the bottom there, except that picture, I was looking at it earlier, I think she's missing a few turrets, because right there you can see three of them. She's missing one, I believe here and here. She should have five. Pretty sure. I don't know if I'm making that up. I don't think I am. So these ships weighed about 25,000 tons and carried 13.5-inch main naval guns, which outclassed the brand new German battleships, which are one of them is on the top there. That is Der Flinger. The Iron Dukes had a thick armor belt of 12 inches. The Derflingers had a 12-inch main gun and a just shy of 12-inch main armor belt, about 11.8 inches. So in terms of gunnery, the British had the advantage. Same with armor, and I believe the Iron Dukes were also quicker than the Derflinger. I believe there were 2 or 3 Derflingers created, but I can't remember what that class is called. Very sorry. Um, so the naval arms race had these two powers competing for bigger and stronger battleships. The British capital ships had the larger main naval guns since the Colossus class in 1910. The British often ran 12-inch main naval guns to 13.5, such as the Iron Dukes, while the Germans struggled to create. They more often ran 11 to 12-inch main naval guns until the Queen Elizabeth and the Bayerns, which each had 15-inch main naval guns. Um, yeah, the naval arms race led to mass naval production amongst the two powers as they raced for bigger and better capital ships. While the Germans were not able to compete that greatly with the British, I mean they were able to, they just couldn't. They couldn't mass produce these size of battleships quite like the British. The British were able to make the Queen Elizabeth and the Revenge class battleships, which, even though the Revenge class uh, were a little smaller and a little cheaper than the Queen Elizabeth, I'd still say the Revenge class would put a pretty good fight against the Bayerns, which I'll get into pretty soon. So the initial design, here we have kind of what the drawing would kind of look like. You have your 13-inch main armor belt, sorry. The turrets, I don't believe they're barbettes, but the turrets would have 11-inch protection on them, and the main guns were 15 inches. For the longest time, the ships had these 6-inch guns sticking out of here. They would do away with that not too long because they were kind of confined to this little area here. So this was the design they wanted. This, I don't believe they came out to 27,000 tons because I believe they were about 30,000, and with every refit, they would just continue on their weight. I know one of them came out to almost 36,000 tons later on. Their speed was about 25 knots, give or take. Give or take. Speed was usually around 24. But anyways, the British went all out with this design, stepping up from the 13.5-inch main naval guns of the Iron Dukes to the 15-inch new guns. These 15-inch new guns were a kind of based off of the 13.5 guns. The 15 ones that they put on these Queen Elizabeths, the Revenges, the Hood, Renowns, and later, or the Courageous, and later the Vanguard. And like in their initial design, they were very rough copies. So they weren't exactly sure if they would turn out to work that great. Turns out they would work quite well. So the Queen Elizabeths were called super dreadnoughts, and the first of the class, obviously Queen Elizabeth, was laid down on October 7th, 1912, and was commissioned on January 19th, 1915. The design was influenced by rumors and reports of battleship designs of other major powers, aka the Germans and the Americans. The Germans, I believe, they were building the Bayerns, and I believe the Americans were building the Pennsylvanias around this time. These rumors pushed the British into creating more competitive battleships. They ordered the 15-inch guns as they deemed, again, the Americans, Germans were building battleships the same size, maybe even heavier gun. They actually weren't. But very soon the Americans would have the Colorados. I believe a little after the war, the Colorados would actually have 16-inch guns, um, which the British would not have until almost the 1930s. Um, at the time, before the Bayern class, once I previously stated, the German main guns range between 11 to 12 inches. For the Queen Elizabeth, I know it says 5 up there. There were supposed to be 6. The last one's supposed to be called Agincourt, which did end up becoming a British battleship, just not a Queen Elizabeth. Agincourt was actually a battleship built. It was given to Turkey. Turkey ordered it. And then once World War I started and the British and the Ottomans were on opposite ends, the British confiscated the battleship beforehand, and Agincourt was actually at Jutland. Yes. So these main guns right here, that would be the main protection for many of the British Navy ships, had a barrel length of 42 feet, each barrel weighing 95 tons. They were incredibly capable for what they were able to do and insanely reliable. They were able to fire a shell weighing 1,929 pounds. These were the heaviest shells in all of World War One amongst all the major naval powers. They were given 4 propellers supplied through 24 boilers, which gave them a top speed of roughly 23 to 24 knots. They were also the first battleships to run off of only oil for fuel. Duh. But yeah. So how did they compare to the Bayerns? So the Bayerns, they were interesting. Their main guns were designed for the battleships. However, with the war kind of turning at like 1917, 1918, and the German Navy not being able to, go out, especially after the Battle of Jutland, they were worried about the ship sinking and all that. They used most of the main guns for rail guns and like large naval artillery. So it was really hard to find statistics based on that, but I would still say the British had a better main naval gun. They were incredibly accurate, incredibly reliable. We will get into just how well these guns performed. In terms of armor thickness, the Bayerns actually beat the Queen Elizabeth very slightly. So the Bayerns had a better main armor belt of 13.8 inches in comparison to the Queen Elizabeth's 13. In terms of deck thickness, the Queen Elizabeth had a 1 to 3 inch main deck, and the Bayerns had a range between 2.3 to 3.9. In other instances, the Bayerns just squeaked out a bit of a thicker armor than the Queen Elizabeth's. However, the Bayern's max speed, very max, was 22 knots, while the Queen Elizabeth's could go a little bit quicker, and then later on in the war, they'd keep getting refits, and they would get thicker and thicker armor belts. Before I get into the next slide, which is the Jutland slide, which is going to take me a while, I just want to preference Queen Elizabeth was not at Jutland. She was in Rosyth. I don't think I pronounced pronounce that correctly, undergoing an overhaul at the time of this engagement. She was the only battleship to go to the failed Dardanelles landing, which was when the British tried to invade Turkey. Um, that was she was commissioned, and then she was sent directly to the Mediterranean fleet, and then tried to go support that failed plan. It did not work. So I just wanted to be clear on that. All the Queen Elizabeths that showed up to Jutland, Warspite, Valiant, Barham, and Malaya are all under the name the 5th Battle Squadron, and they were kind of on their own. They were their own little force, the four of them. They they played actually a very major role in the Jutland battle. Let me take a deep breath. And so I'm just going to read off the slide quickly. The four of them participated. This, I believe, is Warspite, and this is Malaya. I'm pretty sure it's those two. In that order, I'm not too sure, but anyways, Warspite was hit 15 times by enemy shells after a steering gear malfunction, which I'll get into. She fired a total of 259 shells. Barham was hit 5 times and fired 337 shells. She was also the flagship of this fleet. Malaya was struck 8 times and fired 215 shells. She was the kind of rear guard of the fleet, so she was the very back one. And Valiant was not hit a single time during the engagement. She was very close to being hit, but she was not hit, and she fired a total of 288 shells. So they were assigned, the four of them, were assigned to the 5th Battle Squadron under command of Hugh Evan Thomas. Throughout the battle, the British were having extreme difficulties despite a numbers advantage. A majority of the British fleet that went in before the Grand Fleet with Admiral Jellicoe, the fleet under Beatty was mostly battle cruisers, which means they had battleship caliber main guns. However, thin armor, and that did not turn out too well, as there were many instances of British battle cruisers ended up sinking during this engagement. The 5th Battle Squadron had many issues trailing the main battle cruiser squadron, with Admiral Beatty failing to relay the signal down the line. The responsibility of that was tasked on the rear ship of that of Beatty's squadron, which was HMS Tiger, who I think is a cool ship to look at, but I'm not talking about her at all in this. But in the early moments of the engagement, when the 5th Battle Squadron finally caught up to range, they were always, I actually have a map here, they were always kind of trailing Beatty's squadron because of the failure to relay the message, which was extremely frustrating. Yeah, so in the early moments, Barham, which was again the lead ship of the four of them, was able to hit von der Tann, which was a German battle cruiser, at an extreme range. I believe it was about 25,000 yards. I'm not too sure on that. It doesn't exactly specify. But the shell that hit von der Tann's armor belt and caused extreme stress on von der Tann, basically leading to von der Tann having to be her armor belt put back into place. It kind of like jolted a little, having to be put back into place throughout the battle, while they continued to engage, which, I mean, I guess it worked. They would fall out of range again, and then they would come back into range again, with at around 1615, which is about 415, just for reference. This put Admiral Hipper, who was running the German scouting groups. He also had a mixed fleet of battle cruisers and battleships. The sheer fleet, which I'll get into, was strictly battleships. So the whole situation put Hipper into difficulty because he was fighting the 1st and 2nd battle cruiser under Beatty, as well as the 5th Battle Squadron, which this this is what you actually need to be afraid of, these battleships, because they were the biggest and best battleships on the seas right there. Um, so down here at around 425, the British battle cruisers turned and made a run to the north, which had the Germans chasing them. However, this message was not relayed to the 5th Battle Squadron, and they witnessed the the battle cruisers go right past them, and then they looked and they saw Shear's fleet coming up, so they hit a quick real turn. However, this turn was not exactly the greatest. Let me get into why. So at around 1655, the fifth holy, I cannot say that, battle squadron moved again back into the range. However, at this point, Beatty was really not really not relaying the message. Okay, we're going this way. We're going this way. He's not doing that. So Hugh Evans Thomas issued his own command. He's like, I'm taking over. Follow my lead. Expect sudden maneuvers. And immediately he said, okay, we're gonna turn. Okay, he's in Barham. Barham's in the lead. Um, Valiant second. Warspite's third. Malaya is fourth. However, the way he wanted to turn was like really complicated for some reason. He wanted Barham to turn first, then Valiant, then Warspite, then Malaya, um, which would have led to the British be sitting kind of in the German battleship range um, for an extended period of time, which is not really what you want to do. So Barham followed, or Barham was like, okay, I'm turning. And then everyone's like, yeah, I got you. And then Malaya turned way too quickly, which threw the whole turn of the squadron off. But it kind of saved the group from being under heavy attack from the scouting group and the battle fleet. So they kind of got a little bailed out there. But throughout the next hour, from this 5 to 6 here, while Beatty's squadron was kind of out of the range, they were kind of playing out of the range because they had lost um, a few battle cruisers, Inflexible and Indefatigable, something like that. Um, they they had lost those. They had magazine explosions, and Beatty was kind of keeping them out of range for a bit. And at this point, the Fifth Battle Squadron was acting as a rear guard to this fleet. And this is actually kind of interesting. What I found, um, the front two ships, kind of in this position here, the front two ships, Barham and Valiant, were fighting Hipper's battle squadron, while Warspite and Malaya at the back of these two were taking on the entire German battle fleet at this time. Which yeah, you know, it's a bit of an interesting thing there. Which I'll get into more details there. But Beatty's battle cruisers failed to score a hit on the Germans for a while during the problems where they had battle cruisers blowing up. Um, oh, and another one, I can't remember. I was about to say Queen Mary, I think. Yeah, I think so. Beatty finally re-entered the range, and when he did, HMS Lion was struck 3 times by Lutzow. Tiger, who I mentioned earlier, was struck once by Seydlitz, and the 5th Battle Squadron was receiving simultaneous fire from, again, Hipper's battle cruisers and Shear's battle fleet. Um, so I'm kind of going over in my script right now. Um, Barham and Valiant were taking on Shear's leading. Wait a second. Wait a second. Uh, oh no. I am right. I am right. Okay. Problem solved. This is really bad. Okay. Hipper's battle cruisers were engaged by the front two battleships, HMS Barham and HMS Valiant, while Shear's leading battleships were engaged by the two back battleships, Warspite and Malaya. In these engagements, Barham was struck 4 times by Der Flinger, Warspite was struck twice by Seydlitz, and Malaya was struck a few times, but it's unknown to say who actually fired those shells. Only Valiant, who was in the second position, remained unscathed from these firings. Thanks to the engineering of these battleships, they were actually able to take a lot of damage. Notably, Malaya suffered heavy damage from an ammunition fire, which it should be pretty obvious that's extremely dangerous. While the squadron was taking a very significant beating in this position while taking on these two squadrons, they also were able to return fire very effectively and very accurately. So don't think they were sitting there and just taking a beating. They were actually returning fire quite well. Um, while they were doing this, they raced to the north to help out Beatty's fleet, and the entire German fleet was in chase. Literally the entire fleet, except for they also were missing a few ships, but that's whatever. So in doing so, while they were taking a beating, they were also able to score 13 hits on chasing battlecruisen, Lutzow, Der Flinger, and Seydlitz, and 5 more battleships from the sheer fleet. Let me just go back to this here. Actually, no, maybe I'll stay on this slide. So quick little story. During this engagement, there's a HMS Warrior who is struck by multiple shells, and like she's coming to a dead stop, like she's pretty much a sitting duck, and everyone on board is like, man, this is really not good. And then, spared by destruction, is HMS Warspite, who had a steering gear overheat and jam under the heavy load of high speed and like the turns they were doing. Um, so she ended up doing 2 full circles at full speed around HMS Warrior by complete accident. The people on Warrior thought like, oh, they were doing this intentionally. They were absolutely not. This steering gear would actually haunt Warspite for a really long time after that. But Warspite was able to attract the attention of the German dreadnoughts and ended up taking 13 hits. Warspite was brought back under control and survived the absolute beating that she took, but was heavily damaged and had to reduce speed. Once she came out of that, Hugh Evan Thomas told her to just return home. And I didn't write this in my script, but I'm pretty sure she like ran over a submarine on her way home. I think. I really hope I'm not making that up. Um, but anyways, Warrior did end up being abandoned and sank the next day. But yeah, Warspite kind of saved it from an explosion. So this was later on in the battle. This was around nighttime. They had a little night engagement where they were actually extremely close to each other, but they just had no idea. Um, they were so the most powerful British ships in the entire fleet directly observed the German battleships crossing astern of them in action with the British light forces at range of 3 miles or 4.8 kilometers. And gunners on Malaya, which again is the rear ship of the Queen Elizabeth, was ready to fire, but her captain declined, deferring to the authority of Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas. Uh, the commander did not notify these sightings to Jellicoe, who by this time the Grand Fleet had showed up, so the battle had turned heavily in favor of the British. They did not report this as they thought that revealing the fleet's position by radio signals and gunfire was unwise. The 4 ships, well, at this point, the 3 ships would return home after the battle and be repaired. The Germans and British would not have another major battle until Heligoland Bight in 1917, which was also you can't really say there's a direct winner, but the German Empire would surrender in 1918, and most of the German fleet would come down to Scapa Flow, which was the main naval base for the British, and they would be sunk there. Some of them would be refloated, but Um, some of them would not be. Some of them would serve as block ships. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, and I'm sorry for how discombobulated that was, we're talking about the interwar period now, and we're going to start with Queen Elizabeth. So I don't actually have pictures, but think of this slide, the interwar years. In between the wars, the Queen Elizabeth underwent extensive redevelopments, which I'll get into, and the designs and upgrades. And I'll get to this one in a sec because I want to talk about these two pictures because these are actually the same ship. So Queen Elizabeth, she would be the flagship of the Grand Fleet from 1916 to 1920 after the Battle of Jutland. On November 15th, 1918, the representatives of the German Empire signed the terms of the armistice with the Allied powers aboard Queen Elizabeth. From 1920, she was the flagship of the 2nd Battle Squadron and then joined the Mediterranean Fleet in 1924. Before she left in November, she took part in the annual fleet review and then left on November 1st to replace Iron Duke as the Mediterranean flagship. In 1926, she underwent a major conversion following her time in the Mediterranean. When she was done there, she rejoined the Mediterranean Fleet until 1929. She would be detached from Alexandria, and alongside Ramillies, they would go and support local troops in the uprising in the Waft Party, which I believe was in Egypt. I really might be wrong there. And then returned to be a flagship of the Atlantic Fleet in the same year. She would be overhauled from November 1932 to March 1933 and would be in another fleet review in 1935. Basically, what a fleet review was the king would come out and basically you just have as many battleships and flagships around. Yeah, that's pretty much what it is. Throughout these moments in the war, she would take part in a non-intervention blockade during the Spanish Civil War. And before the Second World War began, she would undergo a 4-year-long refit, which would give her a brand new superstructure, as well as her main guns would be able to elevate to 30 degrees. This along with there's a lot of stuff that usually happened in these refits, such as new armor scheme, a switch out of like these guns down here. They'd be replaced with guns like on this deck here. Maybe new superstructure. I believe every ship got a new funnel structure. So you see how it goes from two. They'd all be pushed into one funnel. Maybe new engines. Maybe new something else. But yeah, as I was talking, so these guns here, like in the armor here, they would be switched for these. Some of these would be dual purpose. They'd be given anti-air guns up here, and they'd have a a spotting plane up here that could take off, and then this crane here would bring it back on. So that was Queen Elizabeth. HMS Barham, after the war, became the flagship of the 1st Battle Squadron of the Atlantic Fleet. She kept her position as the flagship when the two squadrons merged in May 1921, so there are two battle squadrons. She appeared in the Fleet Review in 1924. In 1927, Barham and Malaya were sent to Alexandria when there was unrest. There were uprisings in the area. In December of the same year, Barham, along with Ramillies, cruised along the entire coast of West Africa until February 1928. In 1928, she would be sent to the Mediterranean. Here, she would become the flagship of the 1st Battle Squadron again. And in September, after her sister Warspite had ran aground, she would become the flagship of that fleet. She would be relieved from this position by HMS Revenge on June 1929, and between January 1931 and January 1934, Barham underwent a major refit. This was similar to what Warspite, Valiant, and Queen Elizabeth received. However, the physical exterior changes were minor in comparison. Barham was more given better engines and just a whole new rework. Obviously, she wasn't given a new superstructure like a few others, but just like new radars, new anti-air guns, uh, these these multi-dual purpose weapons, guns 30 degrees, maybe new anti-torpedo bulges, stuff like that. Um, Barham would participate in a few more fleet reviews, 1935 and 1937, and she was also deployed to Gibraltar for several months in 1937 after the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. Okay, give me 1 second here. Valiant, on August 24th, 1916, Warspite and Valiant participated in a shooting exercise at night that saw the two of them collide into each other, each needing repairs. Valiant was able to return like really not long after on September 18th of the same year. Valiant's interwar period was quite uneventful in compared to others, as from 1919 to the end of 1924, Valiant was a part of the 1st Battle Squadron in the Atlantic Fleet. She would join the 1st Battle Squadron of the Mediterranean Fleet until March 1929. She would undergo a brief refit. This refit included these two funnels. So this is actually Valiant. I should have mentioned that. She'd undergo these two funnels being merged into one, an aircraft platform right here, and yeah, she'd have a single catapult. Through these, she would displace 35,970 tons before rejoining the Atlantic Fleet on December 2nd, 1930. In 1931, her crew participated in the Inver-Gordon Mutiny. This took part on September 15th and 16th and was a dispute over pay as the Great Depression appeared on the horizon. Basically, everyone on the ship's pay was cut by about 25%, which is madness. March 1932 saw her transferred to the home fleet, and in July 1935 she was once again in the Mediterranean. She would undergo a refit, and this was a complete rebuild between March 1937 to November 1939. The machinery was changed into 8 3-drum boilers and 4 steam turbines, creating 60,000 kilowatts of power. She could reach a max speed of 23.5 knots, and despite the clear, better machinery power that she was given, her displacement with new torpedo like defense bulges and her new superstructure and all this made her quite a bit heavier, so she wasn't really able to gain speed from the original design. In the same rebuild, her armor was reworked with an increase of deck armor to 5 inches over magazines and other small increases over different machinery. The secondary armament was changed from 24.5-inch dual-purpose guns that you can find. I believe these are the dual-purpose guns, meaning they could fire at ships as well as they could provide decent enough anti-air defense. She was also given pom-poms, which would be the British's main defense against airplanes. Those would become the best the British had. They were called pom-poms. They were like 8 barrels stuck together. They were pretty decent anti-air guns. Valiant was also given an 8 HACS fire control system, and her new max displacement by November of 1937 was 36,513 tons, which, I don't think was allowed at the time. Well, at that point, I don't think anyone really followed the Washington Naval Treaty, so I guess it was all good. Warspite. Now we're going to talk about Warspite. We just have Warspite and Malaya left. Later in 1918, or 1916, I believe, Warspite underwent a partial modernization that altered her superstructure by trunking her 2 funnels into one, enhancing her armor protection with torpedo bulges, swapped out the high-angle 3-inch with new 4-inch anti-air guns, and removed her torpedo tubes. After a process, she underwent many refits in the time. She had another refit that finished in 1926. She assumed the role of flagship of commander-in-chief and second in command of the Mediterranean fleet. In 1927, under the command of Captain James Somerville, she struck an uncharted rock in the Aegean and was ordered to return to Portsmouth for repairs. In 1930, Warspite rejoined the Atlantic Fleet. She was at sea when the crews of a number of warships initiated the Mutiny of Invergordon, as I previously mentioned, in September 1931. Um, in March 1933, she was rammed in the fog by a Romanian passenger ship off Portugal. However, she did not require major repairs. Between March 1934 and March 1937, she underwent another major reconstruction in Portsmouth at a cost of £2 million. This refit gave the Admiralty virtually a brand new battleship, replacing internal machinery and significantly changing the battleship's appearance and capabilities. The intention was for her to become the flagship of Admiral Dudley Pound's Mediterranean fleet, but these trials revealed problems with propulsion and machinery and steering, which Warspite was always cursed with a steering issue after the Battle of Jutland. Um, so, and I'll mention that again. It comes up in World War II, which is quite interesting. Finally, there's Malaya. She would receive her first major post-war refit in 1924 with the removal of, once again, her 3-inch guns, and she would also have the removal of her searchlight platforms. She would receive these new 4-inch high-angle guns. These guns were given multi-use and could be used for anti-ship as well as anti-air. In a refit in 1926, she would receive new anti-aircraft control. Once again, the HCAS, HACS, HACS. In a refit in 1927 to 1929, she received a modified anti-torpedo bulge. She would undergo rework for her bridge, but she would not receive one of those main superstructures like this one here on Valiant. She would have her funnels put together and those would be modified into a single. She would continue to undergo another extensive refit from 1934 to 1936. New armor protection scheme over her magazines, deck, and machinery spaces were all improved. Those previously mentioned, the 4-inch high-angle guns were actually replaced with new 4-inch MK 21, maybe XIX guns. These were also dual purpose, and Malaya was also given pom-pom guns. Her speed was retested, and she reached a speed of 23.7 knots, max speed. Okay, I actually need to take a drink of water here. This is a little unprofessional, but here's kind of a good understanding of what the inside actually looked like with all these different rooms, and you can see the power plants going directly to the funnel here, and you can see these gun systems come down to here. These were the loading rooms where they would put the charges on, and yeah, good stuff. Okay, World War II. Give me 1 second here. Okay, just had to take a quick drink. I don't know how long this has been. I think it's been quite a while. But here we go. World War II. We're gonna get through this as quickly as possible. So, just a brief overview. She spent the first while going through a refit. Notably, 1941, her and Valiant were mined at Alexandria. She was refloated, and it would take a year and a half before she would be put back into active service. When she was finally back into active service, she would join the Eastern Fleet in 1944 and would fight in the Pacific before eventually being done at the end of the war. So, she was decommissioned before the war began and had begun extensive work. She was moved from Portsmouth to Rosyth in December 1940, fearing air raids as the Battle of Britain was going on. On January 31st of 41, January 31st, 1941, she was recommissioned and assigned to the Home Fleet, in May 1941, she was reassigned to the Mediterranean Fleet. She would arrive in Gibraltar before being moved to Alexandria on May 6th. She would be a part of Force H, which will become a very common force you'll hear about, Force H, and would escort convoys to Malta, which was a pretty important British naval base at the time because it was kind of near the middle of the Mediterranean, and it was important to keep that in British hands as the British were moving from east to west and west to east through the Med, while the Italians wanted to move north to south. However, Malta kind of made that difficult for the Italians. So Queen Elizabeth would take part in the defense and evacuation of Crete. On May 26th, Queen Elizabeth and Barham would support the air attack from HMS Formidable, on the German base at Carpathos. May 27th, she would become the flagship of the 1st Battle Squadron in the Mediterranean, replacing Barham, who was damaged by bombs during the air raid. On December 19th, she would be severely damaged alongside her sister Valiant after they were stuck by lampant mines by Italian frogmen. Queen Elizabeth is this one, number 1, and Valiant is this one, number 2. The two ships were able to give off the impression that they were not sunk, as the decks remained clear for a little. However, Valiant, when they were finally ready to repair them, Valiant would only take a few months to be repaired, while Queen Elizabeth would end up taking a year and a half before being ready again. She would be repaired and refloated in Alexandria, given temporary repairs in the dry dock, before leaving in June 1942. Get this journey. She would leave Alexandria June 1942. She'd go through the Suez Canal, around Africa, and arrive in the Norfolk Navy Yard in around late August into September. And from September 1942 to June 1943, she would stay there in Norfolk in the dry dock, before eventually being fully repaired and rejoining the home fleet in July 1943. On December 23rd, 1943, she left Britain, headed for Trincomalee, and joined the Eastern Fleet. Here she would support the British, or not only British, but the aircraft carriers Illustrious and Saratoga in their aircraft raids during Operation Cockpit. Queen Elizabeth would participate in the engagement of Port Blair during Operation D. She would be overhauled in Durban very briefly from October to November 1944. She would rejoin the Eastern Fleet and join in the bombardments during Operation Outflank. Here she is. Here's a picture of her in the Pacific. She would rejoin. She'd take part in Operation Outflank. By now, in January 1945, she was the last Queen Elizabeth still in service, which I will get to. She participated in the recapture of Burma until she'd be in supporting the landings of Ramree Island and Chuba Island, and she'd be there until May 1945 as part of Operation Dracula. By July 1945, she was eventually replaced by HMS Nelson, and she would arrive in Portsmouth on August 7th, 1945. She would serve as a home fleet accommodation ship before being reassigned to the reserve fleet until she was decommissioned on May 15th, 1948. In July of 1948, she was sold and she was pulled away for scrap. Next one. Oh man, okay. This is going to be a long one. This is HMS Warspite. She has the most complex career of any British battleship at the time. She served in just about every theater the British Navy was in, and she was the most active British battleship during the war. Her World War II begins in the Mediterranean. She was under command of Vice Admiral Andrew Cunningham, who would be her captain quite a few more times after this. Just before the war began, she was in July 1939, she was in Turkey for talks with the Turkish government. I don't exactly know what the communications were about. But when the war was declared in September, the Mediterranean was quite quiet, as the Italians were not in the war yet, and the French had not surrendered yet. Following the loss of HMS Royal Oak in Scapa Flow in October of 1939, Warspite was recalled to the home fleet. Her first task was to escort convoy HX-9 from Nova Scotia up to the UK. This convoy was quite important because it was carrying aviation fuel, amongst other fuels. During this time, she was called northwards in pursuit of the two German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which had ravaged, absolutely destroyed the armed merchant cruiser uh, Rawalpindi. However, Warspite failed to find the two of them. In 1940, she was reassigned to the Mediterranean fleet. However, this order was rescinded immediately after the Germans had launched their invasion of Denmark and Norway. She would rejoin the home fleet on April 10th, in which she would go up towards the conflict in Narvik. When the captain who ended up going through this, I can't remember his name right now, he had three options. He had one of the Nelson class battleships to pick from. He had Warspite and he had HMS Renown. He ended up picking Warspite to be the flagship of the second battle of Narvik. Here is Warspite right here. This is a really interesting story. She was joined by, I believe, 8 other destroyers here, and they ran in there, opened fire, and Warspite was firing away with these 15-inch guns. Like, it was actually pretty crazy. It's pretty interesting to read about. I recommend you go and read it. The battle would be a beatdown for the British as they sank. The German ships were named Z-12, Z-13, and Z-17 or Z-17. She remained in Norwegian waters until April 28th, in which she would return to Scapa Flow and redeploy to the Mediterranean. Eventually, Norway would fall to the Germans, and the British would all leave, so she would not return to Norway. Warspite would arrive in Alexandria before the Mediterranean War began on June 10th, 1940. Warspite took part in the Battle of Calabria. Here's a picture. This is kind of the only pictures that are available. This picture is from the Italian perspective. One of them is Giulio Caesar, and the other is Conte di Cavour. I probably butchered those, but that's okay. In the engagement, the Italian cruisers applied pressure on the smaller gunned British cruisers, so the two cruisers found each other. Warspite would engage the cruisers, the Italian cruisers, while assisting her own cruisers. And the Italians' cruisers ended up disengaging, while Giulio Caesar and Conte di Cavour closed in on Warspite. As Warspite was not alone in this, she was actually joined by Malaya and Royal Sovereign. However, the two of them were having trouble catching up. In the engagement, Warspite would hit Giulio Caesar at a range of 24 kilometers, about 26,000 yards. This is one of the longest range gunnery hits on a moving target. The other one happened literally a few days before this engagement, when Scharnhorst struck Glorious at around the same distance. Warspite would strike Giulio Caesar with a shell from that range that struck the rear funnel. Giulio Caesar would have to bring the speed down to 18 knots, and the Italians would end up turning away as Malaya and Royal Sovereign would come into range. The Italian cruisers would lay smoke, and the Italians would basically take off and leave. Okay. What's the next? Okay, bombardments. Yeah, in November she sailed from Alexandria to provide cover for the Battle of Taranto, which was a British air attack on an Italian naval base, which actually worked out really well. Warspite and her sister bombarded the Italian supply base at Vlore in mid-December. On January 10th, 1941, Warspite would be slightly damaged by a bomb while operating in Force A during Operation Excess, which was the British launched multiple convoys to Malta, which became increasingly more difficult as the Italians were putting pressure through the air, and the Germans were also putting pressure through the air, and there were also U-boats in there. But anyways, gotta take another breath. Okay. In March 1941, the British intelligence flagged the movement of the Italian fleet, and the British left Alexandria in the darkness on March 27th. Admiral Cunningham picked Warspite as his flagship for this operation. On March 28th, the British and Italian fleets would encounter each other. The leading British cruisers were forced away from the main guns of Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto. This was a much bigger ship than Warspite. Vittorio Veneto was about 45,000 tons. Um, Her and Bismarck are like the two Axis treaty, like who broke more rules between the two of them. It was Vittorio Veneto. She had 15-inch guns. She had a very complex armor scheme. It's pretty interesting, but she was quite a formidable foe. However, air attacks from HMS Formidable would make the Italians turn away. The air attacks would strike Vittorio Veneto and force her to retreat, and they would also strike the Italian cruiser Pola, who was crippled by a torpedo. Here is a picture that I will explain very, very soon. So the Italians took off fleeing. They did not know the British were actually hot on their tail, and the Italians sent two more cruisers to go rescue Pola, as she was absolutely crippled. She couldn't, like, her engines were done. What they did not know was, creeping in the darkness, HMS Warspite, Valiant, and Barham were closing in on the unsuspecting Italian cruisers. They were pretty much point blank on them, and this is basically how they engaged. I believe it was Valiant picked them up on radar, and from there it was over. And then the searchlights came on, and so that would be Pola in this engagement. This would be one of the battleships. I can't really tell who this is. Probably Warspite, Valiant, and Barham would be somewhere in here. These are two destroyers, but it did a lot of damage. They sank all three, Pola, Fiume, and Zara, at point blank range, absolutely blowing them to smithereens. This battle specifically rattled the Italians completely from all their confidence. Um, and yeah, the British kind of controlled the Mediterranean afterwards for surface fleets. Afterwards, Warspite was used in the Battle of Crete as an anti-air battery for the evacuation. However, she was struck by a 500-pound bomb that damaged her starboard 4-inch and 6-inch guns. Warspite was able to make it back to Alexandria on her own. However, the damage was for the Alexandria docks was far too severe. And Warspite would have to make the journey to Bremerton, Washington State, which is on the west coast of the U.S. She would arrive there on August 11th, leaving Alexandria, traveling through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean to Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, stopping in Manila, then Pearl Harbor, and stopping in Esquimalt, off the coast of Canada, before arriving in Bremerton shipyards in August. At the time, the Americans and Japanese were not at war, so that was all safe. It would not be when she would finally leave. On Well, while she was there, she had repairs and modifications done, a replacement of her 15-inch guns with new ones, more anti-air guns, improvements to her bridge, and a much better surface and anti-air radar. This surface radar would come in handy later on. On December 7th, she was put on alert in the yard as the Japanese had launched their attack on Pearl Harbor. When she was completed, she got fitted out and trialed off of Vancouver before sailing down the west coast of the United States to Mexico, arriving in Sydney on February 20th, 1942. She would continue on to the Indian Ocean, joining the Eastern Fleet in Trincomalee in March 1942. Here, Warspite would take up as flagship under Admiral James Somerville. She formed the Fast Group with carriers Formidable and Indomitable, except I believe one of these is Illustrious, but they were one of them was Indomitable at the time. I believe they made a swap halfway through, but 4 cruisers joined them and 6 destroyers. There was also a Force B, who I will get into. In late March, Somerville received intelligence that the Japanese carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, which was about 5 large aircraft carriers, much larger than what the British had, was headed towards the Indian Ocean. This would become the Indian Ocean Raid. The two forces came extremely close without realizing it. In the Indian Ocean Raid, the Japanese would sink multiple cargo ships. They'd sink the British aircraft carrier Hermes and the two cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, as well as a few other destroyers. I know HMAS Vampire was also sunk. Without knowing it, Somerville's fleet was outnumbered 4 battleships to 1 and 5 aircraft carriers to 2, um, which is not exactly ideal. However, these numbers do not account for Force B, which would bring the numbers to 5 British battleships and 3 aircraft carriers. However, the quality of these battleships kind of ranges, and in terms of aircraft carriers, all 5 Japanese aircraft carriers were much larger than the British ones. For a numbers context, when the Japanese came in to the Indian Ocean, the Japanese, between their 5 aircraft carriers, they could carry about 400 aircraft. The British, of these 2 aircraft carriers, could carry about 80, just for reference. But yeah, that Force B, if I didn't mention it before, had the 4 remaining Revenge classes, so who were a little slower and would be very exposed to air attacks. The two fleets did not meet, however, but in the sinking of Dorsetshire and Cornwall, if the Japanese aircraft had flown 5 to 10 more further, like in the distance that the two ships were headed, they would actually catch Force A. And from there, who knows? Who knows what happened? In May and June, Warspite was still under Somerville's flagship and carried out exercises with the fleet before being involved in a simulated attack of Operation Stab. This was a distraction method to pull Japanese away from Guadalcanal, which was an attack between the Americans and Japanese. Very interesting. It's like 7 different parts. It's actually a pretty interesting read. Her surface radar was replaced in October. She was given a new captain and underwent a short refit in Durban in South Africa in April and returned to the UK in May 1943. From now, she had sailed 160,000 miles since the war began. Here, Warspite would undergo another short refit when she returned to the UK in May 1943, and this was another attempt to fix her steering problems. Spoiler alert, they actually would not go away. She would join Force H at Scapa Flow and depart England on June 9th with 5 other battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, and 12 destroyers. Ollie will get into this, the grand old lady. Warspite was assigned with Valiant and Formidable for Operation Husky on July 5th. This was the invasion of the Italian island of Sicily. On July 17th, she would bombard Catena in support of the British 8th Army. Her steering gear would take an issue here because it would take her a little longer to get into position because, yeah, it was still cursed. After this unsuccessful attack, she would return to Malta on June 18th under heavy air attacks in the night. Here she would be given the nickname Grand Old Lady, and her captain, Andrew Cunningham, signaled to everyone else, "Operation well carried out. There is no question when the old lady lifts her skirts, she can run." And there you go. That's how she got the nickname Grand Old Lady. September 2nd to 3rd had Warspite and Valiant bombarding and assaulting the Straits of Messina and continued on to Reggio. They were doing like coastal bombardments. She would cover the landings at Salerno between the 8th and the 9th of September, facing a intense German attack. She would come out unscathed after very narrowly avoiding a torpedo. When the armistice for the Italians was signed, Warspite led 2 Italian battleships, Vittorio Veneto and Italia, back to Malta. She would also do the same thing to Julio Caesar, the same ship that she had fought 3 years before. She would continue to do shore bombardments of German forces holding out in Italy. However, on September 15th, her and her fleet would come under another intense airstrike. She would be under duress and was struck by an early Fritz X guided bomb. These bombs weighed about 3,500 pounds and struck Warspite right behind her funnel, like right around here. Do I have a better picture? Yeah, like kind of. Here's her funnel, kind of landed, kind of dead center, um, which cut through her decks and gashed a 20-foot hole in the bottom of her hull. Another Fritz bomb just near missed, but ripped open one of her torpedo bulges, and there was another one, but it missed. It did not do any damage. She would be soon brought back to Malta, escorted by HMS Delhi, a full like anti-aircraft cruiser, and 4 destroyers. She was being towed by American tugs, and towing proved to be difficult. Keep this in mind: towing Warspite was not an easy job, as at one stage she snapped the tow lines and she started drifting sideways through the Straits of Messina. She would be brought to Malta successfully in September 19th and underwent emergency repairs before being towed again to Gibraltar in Norway. Or in November, sorry, I don't know why I said that. She would be towed again to Gibraltar in November. She would stay there and get worked on until she would return to Britain in March 1944 and continued to be repaired. Let's go here. This is cool. So Warspite would be picked as a bombardment ship for the Norway invasion. The state that she was in was quite remarkable, I won't lie. She had a water tightening retraining structure from where the bomb had actually struck, covering the hole in the deck where the German bomb had come in. One of her boiler rooms was not operational anymore, and her X turret, which is this turret, would not work. So she got picked. She had 3 guns. They were like, "We're gonna do this." Um, so her X turret would not be repaired for the rest of her career. It would remain done. On June 6th at 5 a.m., Warspite was the first ship to open fire, firing at a German shore battery in Villerville from 26,000 yards offshore. She would provide covering fire at Sword Beach, Gold Beach, and Utah Beach. Her guns were extremely worn out at this point, and she returned to Rosyth. She evaded coastal batteries due to quite effective radar jamming. However, she would strike a mine on June 13th. It struck her in the rear and knocked out one of her functioning propeller shafts, limiting her speed to 15 knots. However, this did not stop her. She would be back in action in late August as she would continue uh, engaging coastal batteries during the Battle for Brest, which was a major French port that the Germans had taken over. This for a long time had German U-boats coming out, but by 1944, it wasn't looking too great for them. However, the port would be captured by the Americans on September 15th. However, this time during the bombardment, she would be joined by Monitor Cerberus, who is just a wonderful ship to look at. Um, and the two would bombard Le Havre in Operation Estonia. I can't see. Sorry, my word, I'm reading my script right now, and Word is covering this specific word. I think it's Estonia. Estonia on September 10th. Her last mission was to support the Canadians in the operation at Antwerp in the Netherlands. She would be joined by monitors Cerberus and Roberts, and the 3 of them would engage targets on Walcheren Island and engage German strongholds on the Scheldt estuary. She would return home to England the next day, and the war was effectively over for Warspite. I just want to get into this because I thought this was pretty interesting. So, do I have it here? Yes, I do have it here. Throughout her career, she had been hit by shell fire, struck by a guided missile, an very early guided missile, struck by a mine, and endured bomb damage. By 1945, the British were sending more in-shape battleships to the Pacific Theater, the King George V's, Renown, Queen Elizabeth, and the Nelson, Rodney, all that stuff. I don't think Rodney actually went, but I know Nelson did. Warspite at this point was in no shape to continue fighting, and afterwards the Admiralty unfortunately approved Warspite's scrapping in July 1946, despite efforts to keep her as a museum ship. She would depart Portsmouth on April 19th, 1947, on her way to the breakers. However, do you remember earlier when I mentioned that Warspite was a really tricky ship to tow? Well, on the way, there was a massive storm that caused her to slip her toes from the two tugboats. In the storm, the skeleton crew that was on board Warspite, which was literally 7 people, tried to drop anchor to stop her from floating because now she was in free float. This her anchor did not work, and she drove herself into Mount Mopus Ledge, which I believe is the place in these pictures. Her skeleton crew was rescued by a lifeboat station not too far by, and as Warspite had driven herself hard into place, it would become very evident that it was extremely difficult to move her. There were attempts to refloat her from the position, however, she ultimately refused to move. 1950 brought another attempt to refloat her. They attempted using 24 compressor tanks to kind of knock her back onto balance and kind of push her up here. Guess what? It did not work. They would continue efforts to refloat her. They tried pulling her off the rocks with 2 tugboats, a salvage boat, and she completely refused to move in her awesome, stubborn way. From 1951 to 1955, she was progressively broken up on sight from scrappers. Throughout the entire war, Warspite earned 15 battle honors throughout the war. Jutland 1916, Atlantic 1939, Narvik 1940, Norway 1940, Calabria 1940, Mediterranean 1940 and 41 and 43, Malta convoys 1941, Matapan 1941, Sicily 1943, Salerno 1943, English Channel 1944, Normandy 1944, Biscay 1944, and finally Walcheren 1944. So now, I don't know how long that took. That probably took me a really long time. Now we're on Barham. Barham was in the Mediterranean when the war began in September 1939. She departed Alexandria on December 1st. In the thick fog on December 12th, she accidentally rammed one of her escorts, HMS Duchess. Duchess unfortunately capsized and sank in the collision. Later that month, Barham and Repulse were on patrol against a potential outbreak of German capital ships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. They were spotted by U-30 on December 28th. U-30 fired 4 torpedoes at Barham and Repulse, and only one found the mark. Barham was struck on her port side, striking in line with the shell rooms for turrets A and B. The anti-torpedo bulge, however, did its job, but was ultimately destroyed from the damage. And for torpedo bulge, if you look at this one, I believe this is Barham, this is Malaya, and this is HMS Argus in the back, which was a very early aircraft carrier. But anyways, torpedo bulges, if you see this very bottom here, these were torpedo bulges. They were kind of spaces that if a torpedo struck it, it would not actually damage too heavily the actual ship. But the ship took on a 7-degree list with a speed reduction of to 10 knots. However, she could manage 16 knots after 2 hours of the strike. She would be repaired in April 1940, or at least until 1940. Before she was done being repaired, she would add new lights for anti-aircraft armaments and upgrade in the anti-air detectors and directors. When completely repaired, she left the home fleet on August 28th and was assigned to Force M, a fleet that was created for Operation Menace. She was the flagship of the operation under Vice Admiral John Cunningham, not the same Cunningham from the Warspite story. Yes, kind of confusing, yes. Force M consisted of HMS Barham, HMS Resolution, and aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. So Operation Menace was the British attack on Vichy France holdings kind of in Dakar, and I will get into this. So Force M departed for Dakar on September 21st when the Free French Uh, Sorry, my chair keeps squeaking. When the Free French kind of resistance fighters were captured and driven off by the Vichy France holding the area, Cunningham ordered his ships to open fire. Barham was first to open fire and struck the French submarine Percé, claiming one hit. Barham was next to target the Richelieu, a 44,000-ton battleship in port. The weather was bad on this day, however, and brought pretty poor visibility. And after about 20 minutes of firing, no significant damage to Richelieu had been done, so the bombardment was called off. The following morning, an ultimatum had expired, which brought the battleships back to port, back in to engage the port, Barham and Resolution. Um, they also engaged the 9.4-inch coastal defense guns, as well as Richelieu at 9:30 in the morning. In 37 minutes of the bombardment, Richelieu had been struck by a single shell splinter before the bombardment had been called off. So that's two straight failures in what they kind of wanted to do. In the bombardment, Barham had been struck by a 6.1-inch shell that poked a 4-foot hole in the torpedo bulge. The ships would continue opening fire again at ranges of 12,000 to 17,000 yards. The two battleships were able to hit cargo ships and light them on fire, but really could not hit Richelieu before stopping fire again at 1:20. In this bombardment, Barham was rattled by a 24-centimeter shell, which I believe is about the size of Richelieu's main guns. Uh, that was able to strike through the superstructure. The next bit of damage is so actually they don't actually know if it was 24 or 38. If it was 38 inches, it would have been Richelieu. Anyways, it detonated in the water on the starboard side, in line with the funnel. The shell shockwaves pushed a torpedo bulge uh, in they kind of made a dent within 7 feet, which is pretty crazy. A conference was held on Barham the same day as Allied commanders resolved to continue the attack. On September 25th, Richelieu was actually the first to open fire at 9:04, and this time caught the British by surprise. The British battleships were maneuvering to take their place during their bombardment positions when the distance had opened at 24,000 meters. In the same moment, oh man, I don't know how to say this. Beviziers, and I butchered that. A French submarine fired 4 torpedoes from 2,500 meters away. Barham successfully evaded the spread, however, Resolution was struck by one amidships and caused a heavy list. Barham would end up fighting back against Richelieu in response and would finally strike at a range of 21,000 yards. The shell would destroy a mess deck and dented the armor deck. The severe damage to Resolution led to Operation Menace being abandoned, and Barham would take Resolution in tow to Freetown for temporary repairs. She would join Force H. So once that was over, she would join Force H in November 1940 and would be redesignated to Force F, which was a operation in ferrying troops to Malta and then Alexandria. Um, Something interesting is I previously mentioned the strike on Taranto. While during this operation with Barham, HMS Illustrious was a part of these forces, however, would leave before it was finally done, um, so she could go continue, so she could go launch the attack on Taranto. I'm not quite at Matapan yet, but it shouldn't take me too long. 1941 began with Barham, Warspite, and Valiant bombarding the Bardia off the coast of East Coast Libya. On March 26th, as previously mentioned, the Italian fleet attempted to intercept the convoys or British convoys to Greece. However, they had recently broken Italian codes. The British took off and sailed to intercept. Warspite, Valiant, Barham, Formidable were all the main capital ships in this engagement. Barham took part in Matapan, took part in engaging the Italian cruisers when they wanted to assist Pola. When it was all said and done, Barham would go with Warspite and Valiant and bombard Tripoli on April 20th. Queen Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth and Barham would escort HMS Formidable on May 6th to attack the Italian airfield at Scarpanto on May 26th. Barham would take part in the covering of the evacuation of Crete when the ship was attacked by a Junker Ju-88 bomber, as well as a Henkel He-111. A 250-kilogram bomb hit Y turret. A near miss ruptured her port side torpedo bulge by about 20 feet, 20 by 16 feet, and caused a 1.5-degree list. So there wasn't too much water coming in. It was probably pretty high in the defense. It was probably about up here. When she returned to Alexandria, she was too large for the floating dry dock and sailed through the Suez Canal to Kenya to inspect the damage. Having been worse than expected, she traveled to Durban, South Africa, as she was unable to cross the Atlantic to the United States for repair. Repairs took 6 weeks, and on July 30th, she returned to Alexandria and became the flagship. What's my next slide? Oh, it's Valiant. Okay. On November 24th, 1941, Barham, Queen Elizabeth, and Valiant, with 8 escorting destroyers, left Alexandria in sight for Italian convoys in the middle of the Mediterranean. The morning of November 25th, the British ships detected U-331. One of the escorting destroyers, Jervis, detected the submarine but disregarded it as the numbers from the sounds did not make sense. Basically, they were trying to gauge the distance. However, they ended up figuring that it was probably the British battleships right next to them, throwing off their sound. U-331 passed through the screen and fired 4 torpedoes. Queen Elizabeth was in the clear as she had just passed the bow. At a range of 410 yards, there was 0 time to avoid these torpedoes, and 3 of them would strike Barham. And ultimately, Barham would quickly capsize. And there's a video where, as she's rolling over, there's a magazine explosion. Um, so yeah, that was the end of HMS Barham, unfortunately. Struck by 3 torpedoes. With the damage being that so close, like the torpedo ball just didn't really stand a chance. They weren't really designed to take on forces like that. But we're talking about HMS Valiant now. Here they were during Jutland. Just to give you a better understanding, here's Valiant in the second spot. Warspite is here, and Malaya is right here. Um, Valiant was at Devonport at the start of the war when she was assigned to the American West Indies Station, which I can't think of where that is. She would return to Britain in the middle of December 1939 before escorting Canadian troops across the Atlantic, as well as joining the Home Fleet on January 7th, 1940. Valiant would be tasked with escort duty and transport troops until May 1940, when she would take part in supporting the British landings in the Norwegian campaign. In this engagement, Valiant narrowly avoided a torpedo by U-38. When the Norwegian campaign was over, Valiant was moved to Force H in Gibraltar with the surrender of France on June 22, 1940. The fear of the French fleet falling into the hands of the Germans severely worried Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and because of this, an ultimatum was created and handed to the French. In July 1940, Force H was under the command of James Somerville, whose name has come up a couple times. Force H consisted of Ark Royal, Hood, Valiant, and Resolution, and a few British cruisers and destroyers. The ultimatum basically told the French to hand over their ships, otherwise the British would destroy them. The ultimatum expired due to the lack of French cooperation, and Valiant opened fire along with Hood and Resolution. The bombardment struck the German battleships and battlecruisers Dunkirk, Provence, and Britannia. The last one, Britannia, exploding due to a magazine. The French battleship Strasbourg escaped with 5 destroyers and arrived in Toulon by the next day. In September, Valiant would join HMS Illustrious at the port of Alexandria. For the rest of 1940, Valiant would be used for security duties throughout the Mediterranean. On December 18th, Valiant was joined by Warspite in the shelling of the Albanian port of Valona. Deep breath. Almost done, guys. I'm on page 23 of 26, okay? So this is almost over. Valiant would stay in the Mediterranean and escort convoys until she was involved in the Battle of Cape Matapan, which I've been over multiple times. Oh, Oh, spoiler. I'll just hold it there, I guess. But I'll actually go back here so you can see what she looked like. Um, yeah, once again, she was involved engaging the Italian cruisers from point blank. The British had radar-equipped ships. The Italians actually did not, giving the British a supreme upper hand in night engagements. The British battleships would blow the Italian cruisers out of the water from a range of 4,000 yards. Notably, the late Prince Philip was assigned to Valiant and operated the battleship's searchlights. He was mentioned in dispatches, so that's how people know. Valiant would stay in the Mediterranean after the battle and be stationed out of Alexandria when she was a part of Force A1, the evacuation of Crete. On May 20th, the German engagement began and Force A1 was under siege from the air. Valiant herself was struck by two bombs at 4:45 on the 22nd, but was not seriously damaged. She was able to return to Alexandria the next day. On December 19th, 1941, as I stated in the Queen Elizabeth part, she would be seriously damaged by limpet mines from Italian frogmen who were able to enter the harbor undetected. The mine under Valiant was not in contact with the bottom side of the hull, thus reducing the damage in contrast to Queen Elizabeth. The decks were still above water, however, the ship was nearly immobilized. She was able to be moved to Durban, South Africa, and was there until July 1942. She took part in exercises with the Eastern Fleet in August 1942, and at the end of the month, she took part in Operation Touchstone, which was a test rehearsal to conduct a practice for Operation Ironclad, which was, again, an invasion of French Madagascar. However, Operation Ironclad's capital ship would not be Valiant, but rather HMS Ramillies. Valiant would remain in African waters with the Eastern Fleet until the end of the year, in which she would travel back to England for a refit in January 1943. After the refit, Valiant would go back on escort duty until June 17th, in which she would join Nelson, Rodney, and her sister Warspite to join Force H in the Mediterranean. She would take part in Operation Avalanche in the invasion of Sicily. So there was Husky and Avalanche. They were pretty much the same thing. They were just different steps of the invasion. On September 2nd to the 3rd, Valiant and Warspite would cover the attacks across the Strait of Messina and bombard the coastal batteries of Reggio, as I mentioned in the Warspite one. Valiant would return to England for an overhaul in October 1943. She would be overhauled until December 1st, and when she was done, she would head back to the Indian Ocean and rejoin the Eastern Fleet. With the Eastern Fleet, Valiant would take part in different raids on Japanese positions in the Pacific Theater. She would join Renown, Howe, and Queen Elizabeth, as well as a multitude of British aircraft carriers. Notable, formidable, indomitable, and oh man, I can't say it. Indefatigable, I think. Yeah. On August 8th, the 28-year-old battleship was extensively damaged in a floating dry dock incident. A mix-up of weight distribution led to the dry dock snapping its back and sinking. Valiant sagged by her stern and had her two inner screws jammed, her screws being her propellers, as well as one of her two rudders. Valiant had remained in steam through the incident, which really helped prevent further damage. After the accident, Valiant was really not the same ship. She was planned to go to Alexandria with a suitable docking area to be repaired. However, she could not steer in a straight line and she could not travel faster than 8 knots. She got to the Gulf of the Suez, but grounded at the mouth of it at the entrance before she was forced to turn away and sail all the way around the point of South Africa. She eventually did make it back to England, and she was decommissioned in July 1945. After this, she was a part of the training establishment before being sold for scrap on March 19th, 1948, arriving at the breakers on August 11th, 1948. Okay, we got one more. I gotta take another drink of water. I'm pretty sure this is like an hour and a half at this point. Doing this all in one go. I'm sweating. Okay, that's why I'm not thinking clearly. Sticking to my script here. Okay, so HMS Malaya. At the start of the war, she was called to the Mediterranean to escort convoys. She would take part in a major naval battle of the Battle of Calabria on June 9th, 1940. However, her slow speed in comparison to Warspite led her to trailing the main engagement of Julius Caesar and Warspite. Malaya, however, did fire her main batteries while engaging with Conte de Cavour. Despite her slow speed, she did help Warspite push the Italians away. She received no damage from the engagement, although most of the work was done by the much quicker Warspite. She was later placed in Force H out of Gibraltar at the start of 1941. She would take part in Operation Grog, a coastal bombardment of Genoa in the north of Italy. Malaya, along with Ark Royal and Renown, Sheffield, and 4 F-class destroyers, as well as a single J-class, who was named Jersey, shelled the cargo ships, and in this bombardment, she would accidentally put a 15-inch armor-piercing shell through the roof of the Genoa Cathedral. The shell failed to detonate, but on the writing there, it says, "This bomb, launched by the British Navy, uh, though breaking through the walls of this great cathedral, fell here unexploded on February 9th, 1941. In perpetual gratitude, Genoa, the city of Mary, desired to engrave the stone, the memory of such grace." And there you go. It's on display there. I'm just going to go back to this picture so you can see what she looks like. She was transferred to the North Atlantic Convoy escort duties on March 1941, and on March 17th, while escorting convoy SL-67, she would be spotted by German capital ships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. However, the presence of Malaya would make the Germans withdraw from a potential engagement. Later the same month, on March 20th, while escorting SL-68, she was hit by a torpedo from US-106. It struck her on the port side. It caused a 7-degree list due to the flooding. Malaya was forced to leave the escort duty of the convoy and make her way to port. She would reach New York Navy Yard a few days later and be repaired in New York. This is actually a picture of Malaya leaving New York. She would be in New York for 4 months, and in July, when she was ready to return, she left New York, headed for Halifax, and provided protection for a fast convoy. From here, she would be used for convoy escorts as well as in the Mediterranean for Force H and Force W. I actually think this is kind of interesting. When Warspite and the 4 remaining Ark classes went to the Indian Ocean, Malaya was the only British battleship still operational for a few months in the Mediterranean, as Queen Elizabeth and Valiant were not able to engage, as they were sunk in the Alexandria harbor or they were being repaired. She would be an escort ship until she was placed on reserve at the end of 1943. She would be used as a target ship for bouncing bombs in May 1944. She was reactivated just before the Normandy landings, but was put in reserve as a bombardment ship, so she did not take part. She would be brought out of service again at the end of 1944, and she would be turned into an accommodation ship for a torpedo school until she was finally sold on February 20th, 1948. So what was the state that they were in once the war was over? They were run to the bone. They were over 30 by the end of the war. The economic state of Britain after the war led to the British ships to be scrapped. And in this picture here, I found this interesting. I believe this is Revenge, and then these are Nelson and Rodney. I think this is Rodney, this is Nelson. Even though this has nothing to do with Queen Elizabeth, I thought this picture was interesting. So Queen Elizabeth was scrapped in July 1948. Warspite was sold for scrap April 1947. However, as we know, she did not make it to the scrapyards. Valiant was sold and scrapped August 11th, 1948, and Malaya sold for scrap in February 1948. Here are some war memorials. This one is dedicated to HMS Barham. All of these can be found in Britain. This one in the middle here is designated to HMS Malaya, the sailors that were lost during the Battle of Jutland. These two are for HMS Warspite. This one is where Warspite would have been. This is kind of an overview. And this is dedicated to the careers of the people who served on Warspite. So in conclusion, I actually don't have anything written down for this. They definitely did their job. I think that's pretty obvious. They lived pretty interesting and pretty interesting careers. They were, I think they were the backbone of the British Navy during World War II. Um, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm sorry for how long it was. I'm really hoping my mic was loud enough. I'm a little worried about that. I hope I'm recording this too, because I've been talking for probably nearly 2 hours. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Once again, thank you to my friends for making Bogdan merch and for inspiring me to make more videos on this stuff. But yeah, I hope you guys have a great day, and hope you guys enjoyed this video. See ya!